right, hello, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. Thank you so much for joining this Network 2020 briefing, rescheduled from when we had the big blizzard the other week, and Zoom had a lot of widespread outages. So thank you for your patience as we got this back together. So we'll be talking today about minutes to midnight, so the 2021 Doomsday Clock explained. So for those of you who don't know, we can just jump in really quickly, just a little bit about Network 2020. My name is Courtney Doggart. I'm the president of Network 2020. We are an inclusive international community that's really trying to bridge the gap between the private sector and foreign policy worlds by involving more private citizens in foreign policy through educational programs as well as research programs, and we're really trying to highlight innovative solutions to foreign policy challenges. So we do this virtual briefing series in addition to a lot of other work as well. Brian, what's our next slide? Here we go. Yes, so the Innovators Awards in Global Affairs. So this is one of the programs that we're doing. We worked with the young professionals in foreign policy in 2019 to run what I think was a really terrific program highlighting the work of younger organizations that are really trying to take innovative approaches to tackling challenges that affect the foreign policy climate. And so we're currently taking applications. The deadline is this Friday, actually, so coming up quickly. So if you know of any organizations worldwide that are doing really interesting work in the following categories, please do nominate. We're looking for a really great, robust selection of applicants. So on to our panelists today. So we're very lucky to have with us Dr. Rachel Bronson. She is the president and CEO of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. She's also a member of Network 2020's Advisory Council and was there at the very beginning, helping to drive some of Network 2020's early work and strategy. So we're very lucky to have her for all these years. I will let you read her bio. I'm not going to read a lot of it, but I'll pick out a few key moments. She's extremely well-versed in a lot of different areas. Previous position, she was Vice President of Studies at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. She has also held positions at the Council on Foreign Relations, the Center for Strategic and International Studies as well. Her work really runs the gamut. She's written a lot about the Middle East and energy, as well as other topics. So let's see, trying to think if there's anything else that I want to hit on here. She's a frequent commentator on a lot of different publications, and she's on a board of director of the American University of Iraq Foundation as well. So I'll just hit a few highlights, but I know that there's a lot more, so her full bio is on our website. And we also have Dr. Herb Lynn. He is a senior research scholar for cyber policy and security at Stanford University. He is also a member of the Science and Security Board at the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. So his research really relates to the policy-related dimensions of cybersecurity and cyberspace. I'm reading this now, so I apologize, but it's particularly in the use of offensive operations in cyberspace as instruments of national policy, and in the security dimensions of information warfare and influence operations on national security. So all very current and really interesting topics. He has a lot of terrific background experience. He's a chief scientist emeritus for the Computer Science and Telecommunications Board, the National Research Council of the National Academies, and he's also an adjunct senior research scholar and senior fellow in cybersecurity at the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies at Columbia University's SIPA School. So with that, we can move into the post-event discussion group. So if you like what you hear today and would like to continue talking with everyone who is on the call, not Herb and Rachel, but if you're interested in talking to the other participants about what you heard today, please do join us for a brief discussion after the fact. And this is a chance for people just to connect with others who are on the call. We can open our cameras, we can have a conversation about what we've heard. So with that, I'd like to turn to the actual conversation. So I'm going to just lay a little bit of groundwork. So for those of you who don't know, the For almost 75 years, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has released their Doomsday Clock, and it's a tool to convey human-made threats to humanity and the planet. And it started off with an original focus on nuclear weapons, but it has since expanded to include both climate change as well as disruptive technologies. In January of 2020, the clock, so this is a year ago, the clock was set at 100 seconds to midnight, which is the closest that it's ever been, if I'm correct, right? And this year it has remained unchanged at 100 seconds to midnight. Which seems like a really good starting point. So I'm going to turn to you first, Rachel. Just if you could put a little bit more context around the clock, just so that everyone knows what it is, who sets it, and how can 3 different threats be rolled into one metric? And I'm also going to pull in a pre-registration question that we had from someone who is curious to understand, how can you make, how do you assess the threat at 100 seconds to midnight? Like what does that mean in real concrete terms? So over to you.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Thank you for the invitation. Thanks everybody for their resilience and coming back to join us for this conversation, and really appreciate it and really honored to be with you here today. And always love doing things for Network 2020, such an important organization. It's a great question. Let me tell you a little bit about the clock and then who sets it, and then it'll lead us up to your members' question about what does 100 seconds to midnight really mean. So the clock was created in 1947 by Martil Langsdorff. She was an artist. It was the first cover of our first magazine. The Bulletin, 75 years. This year, 2 years after its first bulletin, creates a magazine. The Doomsday Clock is the first cover. Martil was the wife of a Manhattan Project scientist, and they were looking for some image to convey the fear and concerns they had about the risks of nuclear weapons, especially if the public didn't get engaged. She created the Doomsday Clock, and she set it at 7 minutes to midnight. So that's our starting point. She starts it at 7 minutes to midnight in 1947. And there's interviews with her. Part of it, she'll say that she set it there because the design worked well for her. But if you dig in a little deeper onto that, what does the design for an artist mean? What it meant to her was she wanted to convey the urgency that these challenges and risks about nuclear risks were really significant, but I believe also that there was some agency in it. We had the opportunity to turn the hands of that clock back, that it was moving forward, but that was the warning. What could you do? If we could get engaged, maybe we can move it back. 2 years later, when the Soviets themselves tested atomic weapons, the editor of the Bulletin moved it forward. And then in 1953, after both the US and the Soviets had tested hydrogen bombs, he moved it then to 3 minutes to midnight, which that was the closest it had been to midnight at that point. Since then, it's moved backwards and forwards, but never as close as 3 minutes to midnight, and still recently when we've been moving it to 2.5 and 2, and now to 100 seconds to midnight. So we start at that 7 minutes to midnight. Now the question, Courtney, is a big one. The one you asked is, how in the world do we take these kind of big issues and roll them all up into one? And the answer is the following, which is, and Herb knows this because he sits on the Science and Security Board. Each year I ask the Science and Security Board 2 very important questions. One, is humanity safer or at greater risk this year compared to last year when we set the clock, and this year compared to the nearly 75 years we've been setting this? That was really easy to answer up until about the early 2000s by just looking at nuclear weapons. That was really the existential threat to humanity. By the 2000s, the Science and Security Board was having a harder time answering that without incorporating climate change into that you couldn't answer the question, is humanity safer or at greater risk, without looking at nuclear and climate. And increasingly in our recent statements, those two are the focus, but we've always kept a glance on new disruptive technologies because we watch things like cybersecurity and artificial intelligence, of thinking about how do we answer that question of what's a risk to genetic engineering. How do we answer that question, and when and how might we need to incorporate those issues into answering that question? So it's a terribly big and important question, but you can't answer that question about the humanity without, we argue, considering all of these issues. And so while that wasn't true in 1945, it's absolutely true now. And so what we're asking our Science and Security Board, and you can see who they are on our website, and Herb's with us today, but what's so tough about it is those who are setting the clock, they spend every day working on these issues, whether it's nuclear risk, climate change, new disruptive tech, every day. They're writing for us, they're helping us get authors, we're publishing on it. So they understand the nuance on it, right? So here's the challenge that we ask this very blunt instrument. Is it more dangerous, less, or the same? That's the only question they can answer, the only answers they can give. Of course, it's a yes, but, well, maybe, but if you include this, for sure. And they write on that every day. But on that day and with this clock, is humanity safer or at greater risk? It's safer, it's a greater risk, or it's the same. And so we ask very nuanced, sophisticated people to give us what people often ask for scientists and experts. Just give me a yes or no answer. And that's what we force them to answer. And Herb will attest to the fact that it's very difficult, but they do it. They do it every single year. And then it becomes a global conversation. Did we get it right? What did we miss? Why not? How would you have said it? What would you have included? All of those are great questions. So to answer your member's question, what does 100 seconds mean? It's absolutely that the Science and Security Board, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, is saying humanity is at greater risk now than it's ever been. It's very controversial, right? There's a lot of people who said, during the Cold War, are you kidding? Is it really that dangerous? You know, how is that possible? We are answering yes, it is. And we want you to pay attention. And if you want to learn more about it, we produce a fairly short 12-page report that begins to articulate it. And if you want to know even more about it, we're publishing on these issues every day. So yes, we are very clear in our answer. It's a very dangerous time. And we'll turn over to Herb on this, I assume. But if you read the report, you'll see why we think so, why we didn't change it from last year, and also how COVID fits into our thinking about the threats that we face.
Wonderful, thank you. And Brian, actually, if you're able to find that 12-page report and pop it into the chat, that might be useful for people who are online right now. I'm going to follow up a little bit because when I looked at this year's report launch, one thing that I came away with was how the bulletin used and cited a lack of readiness by government and the public to deal effectively with COVID as a wake-up call for our ability to address some of these other issues that you're working on in particular. So could you talk a little bit about those two pieces, both the governance side of things and then also the public awareness systems that are needed to deal with these crises? And then just one follow-up question in there too, which is also, it seemed like from what I noticed, disruptive technologies weren't really included in that message. It was more focused on the nuclear and climate change in terms of governance. So over to you, Rachel.
Okay, and then that's a really great segue on the disruptive technologies to Herb, who's really led our thinking on this. The way we tackle this issue is we're very clear that while the COVID-19 epidemic is deadly, and we see the numbers, we know what they are, it's not an existential threat to humanity, but it's a warning sign. And it's one we better pay attention to. And it's a warning sign that we are ill-equipped to deal with global challenges. That what we saw the moment that we started learning about COVID was obfuscation and of information coming out of China. And then we saw obfuscation in the response across the globe in terms of what it meant and how it meant, and most perniciously in the United States. We then saw a dive towards nationalism and jingoism that is exactly counter what is needed to face a global threat. Global challenges require global responses. We saw the inability of international institutions that we rely on, such as the WHO, to respond effectively, in large part because key players like the United States were not being productive and effective. And that's not to say that the WHO is not without its challenges. Any serious public health leader will tell you that the WHO has a lot of challenges and needs to be modernized and updated to deal with modern and updated threats, which is true of most of our global institutions. That being said, you need global institutions to begin to coordinate global action, and we did not see that from the participants. We saw efforts to hobble it. So what did we learn from that? We learned that on issues of climate, which are so slow rolling compared to a COVID threat, that there was very little hope that if we couldn't respond when it was urgent and right in our sights, how were we expecting then any sort of response for something that was so much slower in its rollout? So we were very pessimistic. We're very pessimistic unless there's a complete change in how we think about it and how we invest. And then on something fast and immediately, like an escalation crisis and a conflict that's leading up to a nuclear exchange, or a response to a major accident that would require responses because we're uncertain, we didn't have a lot of confidence in a fast-moving conflict. So we use the COVID crisis as a significant and serious problem that the globe is facing, and we're not terribly bullish on the lessons that we've learned. And there's a set of recommendations that we put out of what would be helpful. Now, and this is where Herb can jump in on this, because the way we talk about disruptive technologies is as a threat multiplier. That the way that technology is being used, especially around information and information flows, which is something Herb feels really strongly about, made all of this worse. That the reliance on conspiracy theories and the way information was moving, propelled by political leaders, made all of these problems worse. And that is something we can fix, but it really needs attended to. And it's now a global problem. And we've seen that. We've seen elements of it nationally, but we've now seen the curtains been drawn, and we see kind of globally how ill-equipped we all are. And so this use of information just makes all these threats worse, the ones that we focus on. And as we say, in this case, the conspiracy theories and internet conversations really did lead to death. It killed people. So Herb, maybe that's a transition over for you just to fill that in a little bit, because I know you've been a real leader in our thinking on that.
Well, I think that's right. I think that we talked about we talk about the COVID crisis as a wake up call. It's also, we've also thought about it as a dress rehearsal for the real thing, and boy did we blow it. We didn't have to blow it that way, and there are real consequences of it, but they are a small fraction of what we're talking about in a non-dress rehearsal sense, when the real thing comes. And I think that what the point that Rachel made about the undermining of international institutions, also of domestic institutions that are intended to do this, by politicizing everything. How could masks become a political symbol? I mean, Germs don't care whether they attack somebody who's liberal or conservative. I mean, how could that possibly have become something political? And it's that environment in which, we know how to do a bunch of things that would have made this stuff much easier, that would have made it, COVID still would have been bad, but we know a lot of things that we could have done to improve the situation. And for a variety of reasons, we didn't. And it was those reasons were sort of spread and caused by what the WHO called the infodemic. Lots and lots and lots of bad information, of malign information, not just lies, but overly optimistic projections, ignoring the science, denigration of scientific expertise, and so on and so forth, that we think are just terrible as ways of coping with some potentially very, very serious problems.
Thanks. Yeah. So it sounds like almost like we had, it already would have been a challenge in a perfect world to get the governance and the public awareness systems all aligned and moving in the same place. But with the disinformation and particularly the political climate, it sounds like here in the US, but probably in other parts of the world too, that almost built up walls. I want to stay on this point about the disinformation and information for a little bit, Herb, just because I think that this is an interesting point, because when it comes to the Bulletin and the Doomsday Clock, the idea of nuclear annihilation can create a really powerful image in one's mind. You just sort of see a mushroom cloud, right? And similarly, this idea, and we've talked about this in the past too, that climate change is something that increasingly people are starting to see the impacts of. How does the threat of cyber-enabled information warfare manifest itself as a threat to humanity? And sort of what's your nightmare scenario in there?
Well, so thank you. That is, I think, the crux of the question. I like to think of it in terms of different timescales of doom, if you will. Nuclear war is the sort of thing that will create, you can imagine things happening in a nuclear war that will result in a couple of billion people dying in a week. That's a plausible scenario. And none of the threats that the Bulletin deals with, other than that, on a serious basis, human-made threats, has that kind of prompt acting timescale. Then comes along climate change, where the timescales of really bad things happening to the planet are measured in decades. 100 years, can we survive 100? What's the planet going to be like in 100 years? I mean, that's a really interesting question, and some projections of that are very, very bad, and also we don't know how bad. We have a lower bound on it. Could be much worse than that. But that's a sort of a slow moving time scale. That's the time scale, not of my kid, but of my grandkids. And that's harder. Now, the threat of malign information operations, cyber-enabled information warfare, is a threat that we see playing out on the internet even today. But from the argument that I think we try to make there is that it's not, we started out our concerns about disinformation with the 2016 election, Russian interference, election manipulation, and Facebook, all this other sort of stuff, threatens to undermine elections. Now, you can take a step further away from that, go a step farther and say, well, once you start tampering with elections, maybe there's something to do with maybe there's something that has to do with democracy, and we're all people who believe in democracy, and this is a good thing, and so that starts threatening that. But imagine, and now you don't have to imagine because we have COVID. Imagine the techniques of cyber-enabled information warfare to be spread not just in the domain of politics, but in the domain of public health, right? Which is what we've seen it now, okay? And we see some of the consequences of it, and not just of public health, but imagine what it starts like. Imagine what happens when these techniques are applied in every sector of the economy, in every sector of human life. Imagine what happens in an industry, manufacturing, lies that get told about individual companies, destruction of corporate reputations, and so on and so forth. Education. You can imagine undermining of public education and universities, journalism, and so on. And we see all of these things. So the interesting question is: are we entering a world? The question is, what's the existential threat? It's a world in which people no longer share a common fact base. And it used to be that you could say, you're entitled to your own opinions, but not to your own facts. Well, now people feel entitled to their own facts. Okay, and that's a terror. I mean, it's an existential threat to civilization in the sense that that's not a civilization that I want to live in, and I don't think most of us want to live in that world. where rage, I mean, the world is coming from, moving from a place where reason and reality is sort of the basis of discourse to where rage and fantasy become the discourse, are the currency of discourse. And that's a terrible world to think about living. And that in that sense, that's the existential threat.
Mm-hmm.
And we see manifestations of it now.
Right. Yeah. And that's interesting because it seems, I remember a few years ago, there was a lot of conversations about this idea of the death of expertise. And it seems like that maybe was a trend that was a precursor, was exacerbated by disinformation, where, first people stopped trusting the experts and now you get this whole area of information where everyone has their own facts, or maybe maybe they're all connected somehow too. Maybe it was, with the rise of social media that the death of expertise came along as well. So I want to
can I jump in on that?
Yeah, sure, please. Yeah.
And just picking up on what Herb said there, and I think it ties really well with your comment, which is when Herb talks about the rage and fantasy is kind of a threat to civilization as we know it. I think that's one element of it, but I also think that another way that we talked about it with the Science and Security Board is, as you have that rage and fantasy and different fact bases, it makes it very difficult to deal with big scientific moving pieces like climate change, that these require scientific responses, right? And that and the challenges that we're going to face in the 21st century are deeply science-based. There's going to be more science and scientific knowledge amassed in the next 40 years than all of human civilization. This is exactly when we need expertise to manage issues like the climate, but also the nuclear risk, right? These are very sophisticated weapons and very sophisticated policies. And there's a reason that nuclear diplomacy can be so boring and deep in the minutia. Is you don't want anyone to be surprised by this or move quickly on this, because the danger to civilization is so high. You really do need the experts in those spaces. And so the death of expertise, we think about it, and Herb gave the background to it in terms of a threat multiplier. We cannot deal with these challenges unless we have experts at the table, painfully and painstakingly dealing with them. And we need the public behind them, giving them support to do the research needed, to do the events like this required. And you don't get that without public support. And so by saying that expertise is needed, it doesn't, and I hope the message isn't that it separates out the public. My organization was founded to keep the public closely connected with the science and experts, just because these issues demand such expertise and they have consequences for humanity as we know it. And so that's a tie there that I think is really important.
And I think that the way to tie it to what we've seen in the last year about institutions is that it's the institutions that are the repository of the expertise that you have to build up over time. Expertise you can't acquire expertise in 30 seconds, right? Expertise is something that you have to build up over a long track record of a review and so on. Science isn't perfect for doing things, but the way peer review science and so on isn't perfect. There are many problems with it, but it's the best way we've found to build trustworthy knowledge. And it takes time to build up trustworthy knowledge, and it's easy to destroy the institutions, as we've seen. But the idea is, and what we've seen with COVID is the attack and denigration and decimation of institutions that are designed to provide some kind of social stability because of their being repositories of expertise.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'm going to turn, before I turn to the Q&A box, and if you have any questions from the audience at any moment, please just put them in the Q&A box. I want to ask one more solutions-focused question of each of you. So obviously this expertise doesn't occur in a vacuum. It occurs in the world of politics and policies. So I'll starting with you, Herb. Is it possible to create a set of norms when it comes to cyber-enabled information warfare? It's one thing to unite countries with similar values and a platform of shared norms, but is there any possibility of some sort of global approach that you would see to creating some norms around cyber-enabled information warfare?
I would like to believe that there is. I think I'm a physicist by training, so I've been trained to try to solve easier problems before I solve the harder problems. I'd like to find a way of solving it domestically first. I mean, it's certainly a problem that we see all around the world. But I suspect the international issue is harder to solve than the domestic one. And I think that we are starting to see attempts to rein in the influences that push people off into conspiracy theory land and science denial and so on. At least we're starting to understand those better. It's the focus of a lot of research, including my own. Trying to understand what the factors are. So, for example, one of the things the whole the premise of the Enlightenment is that rational discourse dominates, and that good ideas push out bad ideas, and so on. And that people are perfectly capable and will in fact engage in reasoned argument and debate, and therefore the truth will come out. It's perfectly clear now that for a variety of reasons, which we'll get into in a second, the people, it's perfectly clear that more information is not the solution to bad information, right? What happens is that people have, and this has been well documented now, but it's a relatively recent documentation that is in the last, couple of 2 or 3 decades or so, that people don't process information entirely rationally. Okay, and that they have to be coaxed into it. It takes the time to get people to think rationally and so on. And what social media does is it taps into the parts of people that don't think rationally. And so figuring out how to manage that kind of problem is, I think, where you need to start. And there are people who actively work on this, who try to exploit the insights, take advantage of the insights of the psychologists and the behavioral economists and so on, in trying to understand the motivators behind human behavior.
Thank you. And then Rachel, turning to you on a similar policies question. And I'd like to focus primarily on the nuclear proliferation piece, but because I think that that's something that someone in my generation, I grew up in the 80s, and it almost seemed to sort of disappear for a while, but then all of a sudden this is in the news again. Obviously we're always worried about Iran or North Korea. We do have the New START extension, which is, I think, largely a very good thing, but JCPOA, the deal with Iran, very much in flux and in question, and uncertain whether or not the Biden administration is going to try to rejoin without having any preconditions. And similarly, on your website, there's a wonderful article by Elizabeth Eves that's looking at investment in new nuclear weapons. And so, I'd love to just hear from you just a little bit, where you see nuclear policies going, and what you're most concerned about, and where you see solutions.
Thank you, Courtney. And I was kind of scanning through the Q&A and saw a lot of questions on that. So I'm glad you've come back to that so that we can give it some time. I'm trying to think of how best to cut into this, but the Doomsday Clock steadily moved towards midnight from, so there's a question in the chat. Can you give examples of when it's moved forward or backwards? So let me lay that out, and that'll get to where I want to move the answer. Go to our site. There's a history of the clock. You can see it's a pretty straightforward timeline that it's moved back and forth throughout history. It moved back furthest from midnight in 1991, right? With the end of the Cold War, 17 minutes to midnight, recognizing new arms control agreements in the offing, recognizing commitments to reducing nuclear arsenals, a belief that the need to use them had been reduced, and that a new era was possible, and that leadership was committed to building a new nuclear architecture. We moved it back 17 minutes to midnight. After that moment, it began moving closer for a number of reasons, but in the last 10 years or so, in particular, for several reasons. One is the dissolution of US-Russian relations. Those are the two key principal countries, although of course, North Korea, Pakistan, India are very, very important to this conversation. But the US and Russia control 90% of the planet's nuclear weapons. And when the relation between them becomes so acrimonious that you can no longer have strategic dialogues and exchange of military information or even political leaders because it's so politicized, it's a much, much more dangerous world. So that was one reason we were moving it closer to midnight. And the other is because every nuclear power is investing heavily in their nuclear arsenals and increasingly making nuclear weapons more usable. You can see that in the Pakistani doctrine, India's response. You can see that in the reviews that the US has done about their thinking about nuclear weapons. You can see the Russians exercising their militaries as if nuclear weapons are usable on the field of battle. This is substantially different than where we were in the 90s when we were moving away from that. So going back to the clock, we moved it back to 17 minutes to midnight, steadily was moving towards midnight. In 2010, we moved it back. That's New START, right? That's when you have the negotiations between Obama and Medvedev coming together and beginning to continue to reduce nuclear arsenals. But since then, we have continued to move it then towards midnight as every bilateral arms control agreement has fallen away. And you've seen things like the JCPOA not come together. So a little bit of history there. In 2016, Herb was part of this. The Science and Security Board was together and we were figuring out, should we move it back? And it was at 3 minutes to midnight then, I believe. Should we move it back? Because what we saw was the Paris Climate Accords on the offing. We saw the JCPOA had been agreed to, but it hadn't been put into force yet. And so we basically called out two bright spots, much as we've called out bright spots in this report. Here are two bright spots. And I think with putting a marker down that we expected come 2017, we would move it back and kind of calling them out that we needed the year to see them come to fruition. And of course, when we met then in November of 2016, so in anticipation of our 2017 report, it was very clear that a number of things were going to happen, that we were going to pull out of Paris, that the JCPOA would not be implemented, and an increasing attack on science and expertise, and a recklessness around nuclear language. And so instead of moving it back, we moved it a half minute forward, which at the time was unprecedented. We could talk about that. So those are, and it's very much with climate and nuclear, but there's a really important nuclear part of the story. And when I say that every major country is investing in its nuclear arsenals, now is a time in the United States to really pay attention to this. So to your question, like kind of seems to go away and then it comes back. We've been kind of on this for a while and people thought we were crazy. Like, it's not that bad. Why are you moving it forward? But the fact is that the US right now is on the cusp of fully investing $1.8 trillion in new nuclear weapons over the next 30 years. And if there's any time to get engaged on these discussions as an American, for those Americans on this call, now's the time. Because these decisions are being made now, which is why we commissioned the piece by Elizabeth Eves, why I recommend everybody take a look at it, because it shows the waste and it shows some political pressures to move in that direction, which will not make we in the United States or people globally safer. It's going to waste money and make us less safe. And so that's very much incorporated in the clock. And I really do urge folks to go look at the statement and then look at some of the past years so you can see the nuclear story evolving over time.
A couple of follow-up questions. Oh, sorry. Yes, Herb, go on.
I want to tie what Rachel says to the disinformation game, okay, which is that this idea of a buildup is premised on the very seductive and intuitive notion that the better armed we are, the safer we are, right? You can imagine that as a, the more arms, the more weapons I have, the safer I am, okay? But that in a finite world, that's a crazy way of thinking. But you have to think about that, okay? It's like saying, I'm going to drill a hole, I'm going to prepare to drill a hole in your side of the boat, okay, on your end of the boat. I mean, maybe I want to be able to kill you, but not at the risk of killing me, okay? And that's what the disinformation experts do is they play on don't think about the consequences of it, don't think about the context of it, think about just go with your gut. And it's that's the kind that's where this kind of stuff breaks down, where he says, no, slow down, think about it. I mean, that's where that's the disinformation side of it coming in.
Thank you, and that leads well to the follow-up questions that I had, and one is from Joanna Vostrowski, who asks whether or not the extension of New Start factored into this year's Doomsday Clock, because I think it was in the works at the time. And then the second one is from Nikita Kozhemyakin, who goes to your point, Herb, trying to better understand what exactly do you see as the threat. There are a lot of theories about the usage of nuclear weapons. He's talking about the idea of containment, the idea of deterrence. So if you just want to expand a little bit on that, and I think Herb, you touched on that, but I think we just want to make sure that we get a full understanding of this question. So, Rachel.
Oh, sorry. I thought that was directed to her. First, could I ask if it's possible to drop the Elizabeth Eves link in? I saw one of the participants was looking for it. And if not, it's right on our website at bulletin.org.
Sure,
it's probably easier if we drop it in.
Yeah, if we just drop it in. Yeah, Brian, if you wouldn't mind finding that and dropping it in, I might be able to pull it.
Thank you. And Brian, it's on the homepage. It should be straightforward.
Yeah, I have it right here, actually.
There it is. Thank you.
Okay.
So the question of New Start and how is it factored in, please do look at the report. So why did we keep it at 100 seconds to midnight? We've just gone through 2020, which I think most would recognize as one of the most chilling and destructive years that anybody can, that we've experienced in our lifetime. So how is it possible that the Bulletin left the clock at 100 seconds to midnight? And the first thing I would say is that the move from 2 minutes to 100 basically anticipated a lot of these issues. I have a piece that I wrote on it, which is we didn't miss it. We didn't say coronavirus was coming. In fact, it was on the day of the 2020 announcement that I had my first conversations with a member of the Science and Security Board about this new virus in China coming out that we were just, public health officials were starting to hear about. But we anticipated that there was going to be significant trouble sooner rather than later because of all the things we talked about, the breakdown in international cooperation, the lack of focus on science, the lack of investment and preparation on major events. And we're trying to send up a warning sign that these challenges were happening. We were beginning to see the fires in Australia and wildfires happening in different climates when we should expect to see in one place but not the other. They're having simultaneously. A lot of the things that really came to fruition. But we identified many of the challenges that the globe would face if they didn't address these issues seriously. So when we got to now the January 2021 announcement, in a sense, we had called it. We had said that we would start seeing these things. So then the question is, do you move it again? And so in the discussions, and these are very, very vibrant and robust discussions, there were some who pointed out that as leadership in the United States comes back in, and with an emphasis on science, a respect for climate change and all that, these are issues that we are judging or setting the clock on, and they seem better. Shouldn't we move it? Shouldn't we move it back? That we've seen that we're starting to see science producing the vaccines and all the things. Shouldn't we move it back? Isn't it coming? Felt uncomfortable doing that. It's just similar to what I was saying before. These were in the offing. They hadn't yet happened. New START hadn't yet been extended, et cetera, et cetera. But then so we didn't feel comfortable moving it forward because even though it was a terrible year, many of the things we had seen and were already kind of built into our time, we had been talking about. So it was like as bad as we feared. And 100 Seconds to Midnight is very dangerous. We didn't feel comfortable moving it back because we saw bright spots, just as we did in 2016. And in some ways, by talking about bright spots, that's foreshadowing for us what we're going to be looking for with the potential to move it back. So what we're highlighting is these bright spots that we hope that not only is New START extended, which it has been, but you begin to see the strategic dialogues that are required to actually implement and execute and make sure you can verify New START, that you can begin to modernize some of the arms control agreements that we could think about when we have an NPT review conference in August, which seems so unlikely to elicit anything. Maybe there's the beginnings of some creativity. So I think though there were those who wanted to move it forward, and there were those who thought maybe to move it away. And you can see that in how we talk about bright spots, and there really are bright spots. So to some of the questioners, it's always about doom and gloom. I mean, it is called the Doomsday Clock. So, and we are focused on these big existential threats. So it's definitely not a happy conversation often when we come into it, and we do tend to focus on the threats for sure. But we have focused on, we look at arms control agreements, international cooperation, when it's verified, when it's sustained, because that's at the basis for solving these issues. It's the political architecture. And we're presented right now with such a bullish moment where we really could make a difference. And we're somewhat hopeful by calling out these bright spots, although we have to recognize, and this, I think the board would, every single one of them would say, it is a very challenging time. And on that, I just want to call out, I see that Rod Ewing is on the call as a member of the Science and Security Board, and he's been really important to these conversations as well.
Terrific, thank you. We have a question from Surendra Segar who wants to know, who wants to dig into a little bit of biomedical warfare. Do you see that as a possibility? And just to expand on that a little bit, they want to know whether or not it can be prevented, but also, does that factor in disruptive technologies?
So one of the reasons the Bulletin has done, I think, such cutting edge work this year on the pandemic is we've long looked at bio threats as a potential to be used in warfare and a potential to have really significant consequential effects. And so many of the virologists and the experts that we needed to understand COVID, we've had longstanding relations with. So we do look at bio threats. I think from our experts on the Science and Security Board, when confronted with this, what one in particular thinks about all the time, and this is Asha George, is the fact that whether we like it or not, there are bad actors out there, whether state-based or non-state-based, who have just seen how vulnerable the population is to a bio threat. And that in the United States, we are unable to deal with it. Globally, we haven't dealt with it very well. And we're not able to deal with it in terms of how to move around information to respond in a united way. So pick your bad guy. There is a clear lesson being learned. And it's very easy to imagine how this could be worse. Smallpox had a 30% fatality rate, right? This is not hard to imagine. So what we need to figure out is, how do we respond to this exposed vulnerability? Bill Gates is out there today talking about this as what he sees as a coming challenge and the next threat. He talked about climate change early. He's talking about this early. So what can we do? and this goes back to the public, and this is publics globally, right? We just published this piece, $100 billion on a new nuclear weapon. The question really is, can we sustain public support on public health initiatives that help keep us resilient and strong? These are very hard to defend in peacetime. These are very easy to defend a year or two after COVID. It was very easy to defend public investment in anthrax after 2001, in Ebola after the Ebola crisis, right? But what happens, of course, is when you invest in these kinds of pandemics and they don't happen, they seem wasteful. It's hard for political leaders to defend those kinds of investment when the public isn't seeing immediate trade-off, and there's so many needs in society, right? So we have to begin to build those arguments about how does preparation help us even when it's not an emergency? How does the public health infrastructure and system and early warning signs help us on day-to-day issues that we're facing? Because otherwise it's hard to defend if it's not even once every 100 years. We know it's going to be more regularly, but they're really hard to defend. So we need to really think about how we talk about these kinds of investments, how we give policy leaders the space to defend them when there's so many other needs in society. And that is a public engagement conversation. That's about asking your representative, what are you doing in the healthcare space so this never happens again? And so we have these early warning systems and verifiable and an exchange of information. So just finally, like to wrap that up, and again, coming back to this response, demonizing China for creating this and driving it is markedly unhelpful to that, right? Because China has a lot of questions to answer for. That's where we first found this. We know about, different ways that this can spread, and there is a role of China in there. But it's very important, and they provided information earlier this time around than in the past, and for that they really do deserve credit for it. But it wasn't fast enough, and it wasn't open enough, and they clearly had to figure out their own strategies before they were sharing that information, and it set the world back. But the US administration calling this a China threat doesn't make that happen any faster. It makes it happen slower. And so we demonstrated our inability to proceed in this response in a way that would diffuse the crisis. We just added fuel to the fire and we made it worse. And there are plenty of other examples of that across the globe where we can look at. That's just the most obvious one.
Thanks. We are getting some questions on what public and private companies can do, as well as, and I'm going to kick this over to you, Herb, too, from Anne Ryan, who's says, as a member of the public, I would like to participate in establishing non-technical but understandable to technical experts categories of reporting cyber incidents of many scales, and any advice where to go. So there's two parts to that. There's Anne's question about where to go if you want to establish non-technical categories of reporting cyber incidents, but then also on the larger scale and related to what Rachel said, what can the public or companies, I guess, do in this situation when it comes to disinformation?
Well, on the first question about establishing a repository for reporting cyber incidents that are non-technical, that is a huge problem. There, I would agree there's a need for it, but my own personal computer crashes once a week. It's mostly not a cyber attack. It's mostly some problem that has afflicted it, but it's not a security problem. It's not somebody who has attacked me. It's just that there's been a glitch in the software and something bad has happened. How you get the public to distinguish? I mean, I'm quote an expert unquote. I can't tell whether it's an attack or just a mere glitch. So that's a very hard problem to solve. There are people who work on that, but at this point, nobody knows how to deal with that. Mostly, the way you deal with it is you dial a phone number and call your local geek and you say, "Help me," and then they try to talk you through it. And they're not, they're sometimes good at it and sometimes not. If you forgot to plug it in, then they can help. Other than that, sometimes it's not so helpful. What can companies do? One of the, from my standpoint, one of the most important things that can be done in this is to try to take away the oxygen that fuels a lot of this disinformation. For example, a lot of the social media companies, they offer their services, quote, for free, unquote. That means you don't have to pay dollars for it, but you pay for it in attention. And they give you ads. They sell ads to you, and they sell ads to you to buy stuff. And so the more they can get you engaged in the platform, the more ads they can sell you and the more money they make. The way they have discovered, because they understand psychology, that the way to engage you is to make you mad and to say outrageous things and to give you outrageous things to look at and focus on. And so that's the way you stay on, that's the way you get engaged. And so that's the source of, that's the driver of misinformation and so on. And so one possible way of doing it is that companies, and some companies have started to do this, is to say, we're not going to support, we're going to withhold advertising dollars. We're not going to advertise on certain platforms that don't engage in reasonable content moderation and don't do this outrage, don't try to make money off of outrage. And the problem, of course, in that is that even the 100 biggest companies on advertising on a social media company don't, you would hope that they would account for a large fraction of that company's revenues. In fact, they don't. They only account for a relatively small fraction of it. And so the company can say, well, let them go. I mean, who cares? So that's, but one thing you can do as an individual or as a company is to try to withhold your advertising dollars from places that, and especially to have your ads be associated with content that you find objectionable. That's one thing. Or more generally, until these companies withhold advertising, until these companies adopt more reasonable policies. It's a hard road to hoe, but it's a collective action problem again.
Yeah, and just because we're almost out of time, but I'd like to try to tie some of your expertise together a little bit. One solution that I've heard people talk about is having consumers become more aware of their own information and data and how that's being used, and that data really is the new oil. And I know, Rachel, you've written quite a bit about oil and energy, so I'm not quite sure where I'm going with this question here, but for both of you, what do you see? Where do you see that conversation going in terms of an individual's ability to stand up and say, hey, my information has value, and therefore I'm not going to let it, help supercharge this disinformation universe.
There are, giving people control over their data is certainly one part of it, but then the question is whether or not you can, you actually, when you sign up for a social media company right now, you're actually giving them permission to take all of your data. Okay, so it's not that they're accessing your data without your permission. It's just that you don't have a full realization, a full understanding of what all that data is. You have given your permission. Trouble is you can't control it, and what they're really talking about is much more finer grained controls over who gets it, for what purposes, and so on. And that's just a big hassle. I'm supposed to be an expert in some of this stuff. I can't make head or tail out of privacy policies that are, that go on for 15 pages. Okay, I can't understand it. So how you deal with that is a very big problem. Now, there are proposals, for example, to pay people for using their data. That might have some value to it, but I've never found a way that seems to gain any traction in the marketplace.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're just at about time. Rachel, any final thoughts before we head out?
Yeah, I guess just on this one piece, you know, it sounds really small, but it's like a step we can all take. Sounds pretty banal, but it's a step we can all take, and it's important is to check your sources and really think about what we're passing on all of it. So uh, I was in a conversation with my parents right over the weekend about how effective is the first round of vaccine versus the second. And my mother sent the source, you know, sent me a news article. She found the answer. And I was like, what's the source? Like, you know better than that. Like, I have no idea what the source is. There's nothing about this that it's just something you saw. And this is someone who cares about these issues, could be on this call, right? And so it's just a reminder that we all have the ability to see something that kind of makes sense and confirms what we believe and send it on. And by just taking a step back and maybe finding that same answer, but from a reliable source, or sending both of them to help enable the power of this other source that we don't know, or really doing some double checking, that all of us can play that kind of small role. And that's the equivalent to turning off the lights in climate change. Everyone turning off their lights as they head off the room is not going to do it, but it's something you can do. One person wearing a mask in a pandemic, but it's not going to solve it, but it's something you can do. And asking your congressman about why your tax dollars are going to a $100 billion nuclear weapon when we don't seem to have the money to deal with a pandemic and keep kids in school is another way to do it. These are really small efforts. I know they feel unsatisfying, but they do roll up. And so there's that individual layer. There's the next step up of companies and organizations. Where are they investing their advertising dollars? What are they doing to solve the problem, and up to policy? So you can engage this in all different areas, but staying engaged and educated on it and demanding this become a conversation at your dinner party as you move between all these different issues, and of course move between all the issues, but kind of raising it as something you care about will make a difference. We all know we hit I consent to all of these like cookies. That's clear. The rules around them are clearly not robust enough and not responding to the demands of individual users, of not wanting all of their data available to anyone who wants them. And to say that we have enough regulation around that is a joke. We all know we don't. So we need to kind of keep pushing at all these different levels. So these are kind of the small events of what we can do, but I'm grateful for everybody joining the call today, because they do roll up, and these issues are really hard to talk about, and they're really big. And it doesn't seem like maybe in some ways they affect our day-to-day lives, but of course we know they do. And the way we can show up for them is by Network 2020 providing the platform to talk about them, and just being really appreciative that others have taken the time as well.
Well, with that, thank you both for the work that you're doing. Thank you, everyone who joined the call. If you would like to join the post-event discussion, I think Brian has sent a link in a confirmation email earlier. We do have a briefing on Thursday, and this should be fascinating. It's with Richard Fontaine, and it's on uniting techno-democracies and forging digital cooperation. So it's really looking ahead at, he had an interesting proposal about aligning democracies around that are really focused on tech-based and have similar value systems. So it should be very interesting. So that's Thursday at noon. You can scan to RSVP. You can RSVP on the website, the post-event discussion group. We have a link here, or QR code. There's also a link in a confirmation email that was sent to you. It does take a few minutes till you'll leave this webinar and port over to the other. And then lastly, call, as always, we're always trying to keep these briefings free and open to all. So if you have the ability to donate, please do, because we want to keep this platform open to everyone as much as we can. So with that, Herb, Rachel, thank you for your work. Thank you for your time. Everyone, thank you for the terrific questions. And hopefully we'll see most of you on Thursday. Bye-bye.